The bright sun shone down on the busy streets of the city as Samantha Donovan hurried through the crowded sidewalks, clutching her handbag close to her side. She was running late for her first day at the prestigious Sterling Enterprises, a company she had worked hard to get into. As she approached the towering building, she was mentally preparing herself for the tough day ahead. Suddenly, she was jerked out of her thoughts by the sound of screeching tires. A sleek, black sports car cut across the street at breakneck speed, coming to a stop just inches from her. Samantha jumped back, her heart pounding in her chest. The driver's door swung open, and out stepped Nathaniel Sterling, the notoriously arrogant CEO of Sterling Enterprises. He barely glanced at her as he adjusted his expensive suit, exuding an air of superiority. Nathaniel's eyes flicked over to her dismissively. "Maybe you should watch where you're going next time," he said coolly, not even bothering to apologize for nearly running her over. Samantha's jaw clenched. "Maybe you should learn how to drive," she shot back, her voice tight with anger. Nathaniel's gaze finally settled on her, and a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Interesting. Not many people have the nerve to talk to me like that." Samantha wanted to scream at him, but instead, she forced herself to take a deep breath and walked away, silently cursing her luck. Of all the people in the world, it had to be him. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of their tumultuous relationship. Samantha stepped into the impressive lobby of Sterling Enterprises, still fuming from her encounter with Nathaniel. She was determined to put it behind her and focus on her first day. As she made her way to the reception desk, she was directed to the 20th floor, where the company's executives worked. She had been hired as an assistant in the marketing department, and she was eager to make a good impression. When she arrived, she was greeted by Lucy, her new boss, who gave her a quick tour of the office before introducing her to the rest of the team. Samantha quickly realized how high the stakes were in this company. Everyone seemed to be on edge, always hustling to meet deadlines and keep up with the demanding work environment. Later that afternoon, Samantha was called into a meeting to discuss an upcoming marketing campaign. As she walked into the conference room, her stomach dropped when she saw Nathaniel sitting at the head of the table, casually scrolling through his phone. "Ah, Samantha," Lucy said. "This is Mr. Nathaniel Sterling, the CEO of the company." Samantha bit her tongue, offering a stiff smile as Nathaniel's cold blue eyes briefly met hers. He didn't acknowledge their earlier encounter, but his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. "Let's get started," Nathaniel said dismissively, his tone as icy as ever. Throughout the meeting, Samantha couldn't help but feel a simmering anger beneath the surface. Nathaniel barely listened to anyone's suggestions, shooting down ideas without a second thought. It became clear to Samantha why people described him as ruthless. He was brilliant, no doubt, but his arrogance overshadowed everything else. In the following weeks, Samantha did her best to avoid Nathaniel, but in a company like Sterling Enterprises, that was nearly impossible. His presence was everywhere. His decisions influenced every department, and he often walked through the office with an air of authority that couldn't be ignored. He was the kind of boss everyone feared yet secretly admired. One day, Samantha was tasked with delivering some documents directly to Nathaniel's office. She steeled herself as she approached his door, hoping for a quick in-and-out interaction. But as soon as she stepped inside, she was met with his usual aloof expression. "Miss Donovan's," Nathaniel said, without looking up from his computer screen. "I assume you've brought the documents I asked for." "Yes, sir," Samantha said, placing the files on his desk. She tried to leave, but before she could turn around, Nathaniel finally looked up. "You seem to have something on your mind," he said, his tone almost teasing. Samantha hesitated, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "You know, just because you're the CEO doesn't mean you have to treat people like they're beneath you." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into that infuriating smirk. "Is that so? And here I thought I was just being efficient." Samantha's fists clenched at her sides. There's a difference between being efficient and being insufferable. For a brief moment, Nathaniel looked genuinely surprised by her words, but he quickly recovered. "I see you're not afraid to speak your mind. I'll keep that in mind, Miss Roberts." Samantha left his office feeling a mixture of triumph and frustration. Nathaniel Sterling might be powerful, but she wasn't going to let him walk all over her. Despite their clashes, Samantha couldn't deny that Nathaniel intrigued her. Beneath his arrogance and icy demeanor, she sensed there was more to him than met the eye. But she refused to let herself be drawn in. She hated him, after all, or so she kept telling herself. One evening, after a long day at work, Samantha found herself staying late at the office to finish a project. The building was quiet, and most of the staff had already gone home. As she sat at her desk, concentrating on her work, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. She looked up to see Nathaniel standing in the doorway of her office. "Working late, Miss Donovan's?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Samantha nodded, trying to hide her surprise. "I've got a lot to finish before tomorrow." Nathaniel leaned against the doorframe, his expression thoughtful. "You're dedicated. I can appreciate that." Samantha wasn't sure how to respond. This wasn't the arrogant Nathaniel she was used to. He seemed almost human. For a brief moment, the tension between them shifted. "I stay late too, sometimes," Nathaniel continued, as if he were trying to justify his presence. "Running a company like this, it's not easy." Samantha studied him carefully, unsure of what to make of this sudden vulnerability. Was he really opening up to her, or was this just another one of his mind games? "Well," she said cautiously, "I'm sure it's a lot of pressure." Nathaniel's eyes met hers, and for the first time, Samantha saw something she hadn't expected: loneliness. It was fleeting, gone in an instant, but it was there. Before she could say anything more, Nathaniel straightened up and cleared his throat. "Don't stay too late. It's not safe to be here alone at night." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Samantha more confused than ever. For the first time since she had started working at Sterling Enterprises, she wondered if there was more to Nathaniel Sterling than she had originally thought. The days that followed after Samantha's late-night encounter with Nathaniel were filled with confusion and tension. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than his icy exterior. Yet, every time she reminded herself of this, she immediately shut it down, refusing to be lured by his brief moment of vulnerability. At work, Nathaniel's arrogant facade had returned in full force, and Samantha was quickly reminded of why she had despised him from the start. She still bristled every time she had to deal with him. Unfortunately for her, their interactions were becoming more frequent. One afternoon, the marketing department was preparing a presentation for a major client, and Samantha, being one of the key contributors to the project, had been called in to present her ideas. As she stood in the boardroom, her nerves on edge, Nathaniel entered, commanding the room with his mere presence. He sat at the head of the table, his eyes focused solely on her, as if daring her to impress him. Samantha took a deep breath and launched into her presentation. Despite her earlier anxiety, she spoke confidently, laying out her vision for the campaign with clarity and passion. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, but the only gaze that mattered to her in that moment was Nathaniel's. When she finished, the room was silent for a beat, and Samantha braced herself for Nathaniel's inevitable critique. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "It's acceptable," he said after a long pause. Samantha's heart sank. She had worked so hard on this project, only to be dismissed with a single word. But then, to her surprise, Nathaniel continued, "In fact, it's more than that. This is the kind of creativity we need to push this company forward." Samantha blinked, taken aback. Was that a compliment? Coming from him? "Good work, Miss Donovan," he added, his tone still cool, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Pride? No, it couldn't be. Nathaniel Sterling didn't do praise, not genuinely at least. As the meeting ended and people began to leave, Nathaniel caught Samantha's arm lightly. "I'll expect you in my office tomorrow to discuss the next steps." Samantha pulled her arm back, feeling the electricity of his touch lingering on her skin. "Of course," she muttered, her mind whirling. He turned and left without another word, leaving Samantha standing there, wondering if he was starting to see her in a different light. or if she was seeing him that way. The next morning, Samantha found herself nervously heading toward Nathaniel's office. His sudden compliment during the meeting still played in her head, and she couldn't help but wonder what he wanted to discuss. When she arrived, she knocked and heard his usual cold enter from behind the door. As she walked in, Nathaniel was seated at his massive desk, surrounded by paperwork. He didn't look up immediately, making her feel like an unimportant distraction. After a few moments, he finally glanced at her. "Sit down," he ordered, motioning to the chair across from him. Samantha complied, sitting stiffly as Nathaniel slid a folder across the desk. "This is the proposal for the campaign. I want you to oversee it from here on out." Her heart raced as she opened the folder and scanned the contents. "You want me to be in charge? Is that a problem?" Nathaniel raised an eyebrow, a slight smirk playing on his lips. "And no, it's just," she faltered, surprised at the level of responsibility he was giving her. "I'm grateful for the opportunity." Nathaniel's expression softened slightly, though his demeanor remained professional. "Good. I don't expect mediocrity. Prove that your ideas weren't just a one-time stroke of luck." Samantha was about to respond when suddenly, the door to Nathaniel's office swung open, and in walked a stunning woman dressed in a designer outfit that screamed wealth. Her entrance was so seamless, as though she owned the place. "Darling," the woman purred, ignoring Samantha entirely as she sauntered toward Nathaniel, her red-painted lips curving into a smile. "I thought we were going to have lunch today." Nathaniel's face remained impassive, but Samantha could sense his frustration. "Not now, Amelia. I'm in the middle of a meeting." Amelia's eyes flicked to Samantha for the first time, sizing her up with a look of thinly veiled contempt. "Oh, I didn't realize you were busy," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I'll just wait outside." With that, Amelia turned on her heel and left, her heels clicking loudly against the marble floor. Samantha remained silent, trying to process what had just happened. Who was Amelia, and why did it bother her to see this woman with Nathaniel? It wasn't like she cared about him on a personal level. Or did she? Nathaniel sighed, rubbing his temples. "Ignore her." Samantha raised an eyebrow. "Who is she, exactly?" "None of your concern," Nathaniel snapped, clearly irritated. Samantha frowned, but decided not to push further. She gathered her things and stood up. "I'll get started on the campaign." As she left his office, her mind raced. Nathaniel's personal life was none of her business, but something about Amelia's appearance left her feeling uneasy, and she hated that it affected her at all. The following week, Samantha threw herself into her work, determined to prove to Nathaniel that she was capable of handling the campaign. But no matter how hard she tried to focus, her thoughts kept drifting back to him. The more she saw of Nathaniel, the harder it became to ignore the strange pull between them. Every time they interacted, there was a palpable tension. It wasn't just the usual irritation she felt around him. It was something deeper, more unsettling. Nathaniel was still infuriating, still arrogant. But there were moments when she caught glimpses of something else. A vulnerability he tried to hide, perhaps even from himself. One afternoon, as Samantha worked late in the office, she heard a knock on the door. She looked up to find Nathaniel standing in the doorway, his usual mask of indifference in place. But there was something different in his eyes, something softer. "Still working?" he asked, his voice low. Samantha nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Nathaniel stepped inside, closing the door behind him. For a moment, there was only silence between them. Then, to Samantha's surprise, Nathaniel walked over to her desk and leaned against it, his posture more relaxed than usual. "I've been meaning to thank you," he said quietly. "The campaign, it's going well. You've exceeded my expectations." Samantha's heart skipped a beat. She had never heard him speak so sincerely before. "Thank you," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel's eyes met hers, and for the first time, there was no arrogance, no distance between them, just two people standing on the edge of something neither of them understood. "I don't do this often," he admitted. his voice barely audible, letting people in. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. Was this the real Nathaniel Sterling? The man behind the cold exterior? Before she could respond, Nathaniel straightened up, his expression hardening once again. But don't mistake this for something it's not. Samantha blinked, taken aback by his sudden shift. What's that supposed to mean? Nathaniel's jaw tightened. It means that you and we're not friends. Don't get any ideas? Samantha's heart sank, anger flaring up inside her. I wouldn't dream of it, she spat, grabbing her things and storming out of the office. As she left, she couldn't help but wonder why Nathaniel was so determined to push her away, and why it hurt so much when he did. Over the next few days, Samantha tried to avoid Nathaniel as much as possible, but it was difficult when they worked so closely together. Every time she saw him, her heart twisted with frustration. She hated the way he could get under her skin so easily, the way he made her feel things she didn't want to feel. Meanwhile, Nathaniel was dealing with his own inner turmoil. He had spent his entire life keeping people at arm's length, never allowing anyone to get too close. But Samantha, she was different. She challenged him, frustrated him, and yet, somehow, she had managed to break through the walls he had so carefully built. One evening, after another long day at work, Samantha found herself standing outside the office building, waiting for a cab. It had started raining, and she cursed under her breath, pulling her coat tighter around her. Suddenly, a sleek black car pulled up beside her. The window rolled down, and Nathaniel's face appeared, his expression unreadable. "Get in," he said. Samantha hesitated, her pride telling her to refuse. But the rain was pouring down harder now, and she had no umbrella. Reluctantly, she opened the door and slid into the passenger seat. The tension between them was thick as Nathaniel drove in silence. "Why are you doing this?" Samantha finally asked, breaking the heavy silence in the car. Her voice was tight with frustration and confusion, a mix of emotions she couldn't quite understand. Nathaniel's grip tightened on the steering wheel as if bracing himself for a response he wasn't ready to give. "Because it's raining," he replied, his tone sharp, as though dismissing her question would make the tension between them disappear. Samantha turned to face him, her brows furrowed. "That's not what I mean, and you know it." Nathaniel's jaw clenched. He didn't answer right away, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. It was as if he was grappling with something he didn't want to acknowledge, something that went beyond the simple act of offering her a ride. The silence stretched between them until finally, Nathaniel spoke, his voice softer, almost hesitant. "You're under my watch. I don't want you catching a cold." Samantha blinked in surprise. It wasn't the answer she was expecting, and yet, it made something in her chest tighten. It was the smallest glimpse of concern, hidden beneath layers of his usual arrogance. But before she could say anything, Nathaniel changed the subject abruptly. "I have something to ask you," he said, his tone reverting to its usual authoritative demeanor. "There's a charity gala this weekend. I need someone to accompany me." Samantha's eyes widened in shock. "You want me to go with you? Why?" Nathaniel kept his gaze on the road, his expression unreadable. "I need someone who can hold their own in a room full of corporate sharks. You've proven you can do that. Besides," he hesitated for a moment, his voice lowering, "Amelia's been pestering me about it, and I need a distraction." Samantha scoffed, folding her arms across her chest. "So I'm just a pawn in your game to keep your social life in check?" Nathaniel glanced at her briefly, his eyes hardening. "You're free to decline, but I thought you might like the opportunity to network." Samantha wanted to refuse, to throw his offer back in his face. But a part of her, a small, curious part, was intrigued. Attending a gala with Nathaniel Sterling would open doors for her career. And though she hated to admit it, a part of her wanted to see him in a different light, away from the office. "Fine," she muttered, crossing her arms tighter. "But don't expect me to be your personal shield all night." A faint smile tugged at the corner of Nathaniel's lips, though it vanished just as quickly. "Wouldn't dream of it." As the car pulled up to her apartment, Samantha stepped out into the now light drizzle, feeling a strange mix of emotions. She hated him, his arrogance, his coldness. But there was something else, something buried beneath the surface, and it scared her that she wanted to uncover it. The night of the gala arrived faster than Samantha had anticipated. She stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the deep emerald gown she had chosen for the event. It clung to her figure perfectly, elegant yet simple, nothing too flashy. As she applied the final touches to her makeup, she felt a swirl of nerves in her stomach. What was she doing? Attending a gala with Nathaniel Sterling, the man she claimed to despise? But she had agreed, and now there was no turning back. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, Nathaniel stood before her, looking every bit the powerful businessman in a tailored black suit, his hair slicked back. For a brief moment, Samantha found herself struck by how devastatingly handsome he looked. His presence was overwhelming, and it annoyed her that her heart betrayed her with a quickened pace. Nathaniel's gaze swept over her, his eyes lingering for just a second longer than necessary. "You look acceptable," he said, though his voice was softer than usual. Samantha rolled her eyes, but couldn't help the faint blush that crept into her cheeks. "You're such a charmer, Nathaniel." They made their way to the gala in near silence, the tension between them growing with every passing minute. When they arrived at the grand venue, Samantha was immediately struck by the opulence of the event. Chandeliers glittered from above, and the room buzzed with the chatter of the city's elite. Nathaniel offered his arm to her as they entered, and though she hesitated for a moment, she reluctantly accepted. As they moved through the crowd, Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on them, whispers trailing in their wake. It was clear that Nathaniel was a man who commanded attention, and by extension, so did she. As they mingled with various business partners and executives, Samantha couldn't help but notice how smoothly Nathaniel navigated the social scene. He was charming, calculated in his interactions, and completely in control. Yet, every now and then, she caught him glancing at her, brief, almost imperceptible looks that made her question what was going on behind those stormy eyes of his. At one point in the evening, they found themselves alone by the bar, the noise of the crowd a distant hum around them. Samantha sipped her drink, trying to keep her guard up, but Nathaniel's presence made it difficult. "You're doing well," he said, his voice low as he leaned against the bar beside her. "Better than I expected." Samantha shot him a sidelong glance. "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" Nathaniel smirked, his gaze softening ever so slightly. "Take it however you want." She huffed, turning her attention back to her drink. "I still don't understand why you asked me to come with you tonight." For a moment, Nathaniel said nothing. Then, almost hesitantly, he spoke. "Because I knew you'd make this night bearable." Samantha blinked, taken aback by his admission. "You don't actually enjoy these things, do you?" Nathaniel's expression darkened slightly, his eyes clouded with something she couldn't quite place. "No, I don't." Before Samantha could press further, a familiar voice cut through the air. "Nathaniel." They both turned to see Amelia approaching, her smile as sharp as ever. Samantha stiffened as the beautiful woman sauntered over, her eyes briefly flicking to Samantha before settling on Nathaniel. "There you are. I've been looking for you all night," Amelia said, her voice dripping with sweetness. Nathaniel's demeanor shifted instantly, his posture stiffening as if he were bracing himself for a confrontation. "Amelia," he greeted her coolly, his tone void of any warmth. Amelia's smile faltered slightly, her gaze sliding over to Samantha again, her expression one of thinly veiled contempt. "And you've brought a date," she said, her voice laced with venom. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her composure, refusing to let Amelia get under her skin. "Yes," Nathaniel replied simply, his eyes hardening. "I have." Samantha wasn't sure what surprised her more, Nathaniel's firm response or the fact that, in that moment, it felt like he was choosing her over Amelia. The rest of the night passed in a blur of small talk and social obligations, But Samantha couldn't shake the tension that lingered in the air after Amelia's appearance. It was clear there was history between her and Nathaniel, though he had made it equally clear that whatever that history was, it was over. As the evening drew to a close, Nathaniel and Samantha found themselves once again alone, standing outside the venue as they waited for his car to arrive. The night air was cool, and the stars shimmered above them, casting a soft glow over the city. Nathaniel remained quiet, his gaze distant as if lost in thought. Samantha, too, was deep in her own mind, trying to make sense of the conflicting emotions swirling within her. Finally, she broke the silence. What was that back there? With Amelia? Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't look at her. It's nothing you need to concern yourself with. Samantha narrowed her eyes, frustration bubbling to the surface. You keep saying that, but you've clearly got some unfinished business with her. Why can't you just be honest for once? Nathaniel turned to her then, his eyes cold but also pained. Because I don't owe you an explanation, Samantha. Her heart sank at his words, but she refused to let him see how much they hurt. Fine, she muttered, stepping away from him as the car pulled up. As they drove back to her apartment, the silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words and unresolved tension. Samantha stared out the window, trying to convince herself that she didn't care about whatever Nathaniel was hiding. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Because despite everything, despite his arrogance, his coldness, his infuriating attitude, she was starting to care, and that terrified her. The next day at Sterling Enterprises was business as usual, or at least, it appeared to be on the surface. Samantha was seated at her desk, trying to focus on her work, but her mind kept wandering back to the previous night at the gala. Nathaniel's behavior, his distance, his coldness, and the way he had responded to Amelia lingered in her thoughts like a storm cloud refusing to clear. She couldn't shake the feeling that Nathaniel was hiding something deeper than just his arrogance, and it bothered her more than she wanted to admit. As she went about her tasks, Samantha caught glimpses of Nathaniel through the glass walls of his office. He was, as always, focused on his work, his brow furrowed in concentration. But there was a tension in his posture today, a tightness around his eyes that made her wonder if he was thinking about the gala too. By midday, Samantha's curiosity got the better of her. She knocked on his office door lightly, waiting for his gruff, "Come in," before stepping inside. Nathaniel didn't look up from his computer screen as she entered, his fingers still typing away. "What is it?" he asked, his tone brusque. Samantha hesitated for a moment, then cleared her throat. "I wanted to talk about last night." That got his attention. Nathaniel's hands paused on the keyboard, and he finally looked up, his eyes sharp and unreadable. "There's nothing to talk about." She frowned, stepping closer to his desk. "I think there is. You were acting strange after Amelia showed up. You can't just pretend it didn't happen." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, folding his arms over his chest. "What exactly are you trying to get at, Samantha?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a warning that she was treading into dangerous territory. But Samantha had never been one to back down easily. "I'm trying to understand why you're so closed off. Why you push everyone away," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Including me." Nathaniel's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Samantha thought he might shut her down entirely. But then something shifted in his expression. Just for a second, the mask slipped, and she saw a flash of something vulnerable, something human. "I push people away because it's easier that way," Nathaniel said quietly, his voice strained. "People always leave, Samantha. It's just a matter of time. So why bother getting close in the first place?" Samantha's heart clenched at his words. It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to her, and it made her realize that beneath his arrogance and cold demeanor, Nathaniel was a man who had been hurt deeply, a man who had built walls so high no one could get through. But she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "Not everyone leaves," she said softly, taking a step closer to his desk. "And maybe if you let people in, you'd see that." Nathaniel stared at her, his gaze intense and searching, as if he was trying to figure out if he could trust her. But before he could respond, there was a knock at the door. It was Jacob, Nathaniel's assistant, looking uncomfortable as he interrupted their moment. "Mr. Sterling, there's a call for you. It's urgent." Nathaniel's expression hardened again, the vulnerability vanishing in an instant. "I'll take it in a moment," he said sharply. Jacob nodded and quickly exited the room, leaving Samantha standing there, feeling the weight of the moment slipping away. "I have to take this," Nathaniel said, his tone returning to its usual businesslike demeanor. Samantha nodded, biting her lip to hold back the frustration building inside her. "We'll finish this conversation later," she said, more as a promise than a question. Nathaniel didn't respond, his attention already shifting back to his work, but Samantha could see it in his eyes. He wasn't as indifferent as he pretended to be. Days passed, and though things seemed to return to normal at Sterling Enterprises, the dynamic between Samantha and Nathaniel had undeniably shifted. Their interactions were still professional, but there was an undercurrent of something else now, something neither of them could quite ignore. Samantha found herself watching Nathaniel more closely, noticing the small things about him that she had overlooked before. The way he furrowed his brow when he was deep in thought, the way his fingers drummed on his desk when he was irritated, the rare moments when a faint smile would tug at the corners of his mouth. And, much to her dismay, she found herself thinking about him more often than she cared to admit. Despite everything, despite his arrogance and his coldness, Nathaniel was starting to get under her skin. It didn't help that he seemed to be softening towards her as well. There were moments when he would catch her eye and hold her gaze a little too long, moments when he would make a passing comment that was almost kind. But just as quickly as those moments came, they would vanish, replaced by Nathaniel's usual arrogance and distant attitude. It was as if he was constantly fighting with himself, struggling to keep his walls up, even as they were slowly crumbling around him. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling meeting, Samantha found herself alone in the conference room, her head spinning from the endless corporate jargon. Nathaniel had been unusually quiet during the meeting, which was strange enough to catch her attention. Normally, he dominated every discussion, ensuring that everyone knew exactly who was in charge. But today, he had barely spoken a word. As she gathered her things to leave, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Nathaniel lingering by the door, his expression unreadable. "You look distracted today," Samantha said, breaking the silence. "Is something wrong?" Nathaniel's gaze flicked up to meet hers, and for a moment, she thought he might dismiss her question as he usually did. But instead, he sighed, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "Nothing you need to concern yourself with," he muttered. But there was no bite in his voice, no coldness. It was as though he was too tired to keep up the facade today. Samantha hesitated, unsure whether to press him further. But something told her that this was one of those rare moments when Nathaniel was letting his guard down, even if just for a second. "Look," she began cautiously, "I know I'm probably the last person you want to open up to, but you don't have to carry everything on your own. Whatever's bothering you, maybe it'll help to talk about it." Nathaniel scoffed, though it lacked its usual arrogance. "You think I need someone to talk to? Someone like you?" Samantha crossed her arms, not backing down. "Maybe. Or maybe you just need to stop pretending that you're invincible." Nathaniel's eyes flashed, a mixture of anger and something else, something raw. He stepped closer to her, his tall frame towering over hers, and for a moment, Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She expected him to lash out, to snap at her for daring to speak to him that way. But instead, his shoulders slumped, and the fight seemed to drain out of him. "I don't pretend to be invincible, Samantha," he said quietly, his voice filled with an edge of bitterness. "I just know better than to rely on anyone." Samantha frowned, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his words. This was the Nathaniel she had seen glimpses of, the man behind the carefully constructed walls. And in that moment, she realized that he wasn't as different from her as she had thought. Before she could respond, Nathaniel turned away, his expression hardening once again. "This conversation is over," he said coldly, walking towards the door. Samantha watched him leave, feeling a mix of frustration and sadness. He was so close to letting her in, and yet he still refused to take that final step. It was as if he was terrified of what would happen if he did. And despite her growing feelings for him, Samantha wasn't sure how much longer she could wait for Nathaniel to stop fighting himself. The next few days were tense between Samantha and Nathaniel. Their conversations were brief, their interactions limited to work. Samantha had thought that after their almost heart-to-heart, things would change between them. But if anything, Nathaniel had become even more distant, retreating back into the safety of his arrogance and cold demeanor. It frustrated her to no end. She knew there was more to him than the ruthless businessman he portrayed, but every time she got close to breaking through, he pushed her away, and she was starting to wonder if it was worth the emotional toll. That all changed when Nathaniel called her into his office late one afternoon. He was seated behind his desk, his expression unreadable as always, but there was something different in the way he looked at her, something almost desperate. "I need your help with something," he said, his voice low and serious. Samantha blinked in surprise. Nathaniel Sterling never asked for help. "What is it?" He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "There's a merger on the horizon with one of our biggest competitors. It's a complicated deal, and I need to ensure everything goes smoothly." Samantha frowned, still confused as to what this had to do with her. "And what does that have to do with me?" Nathaniel leaned forward, his gaze locking onto hers. "The CEO of the other company. He's a traditionalist. He believes in business being done with a personal connection, not just contracts and numbers. He'll only finalize the deal if he sees that I have stability in my personal life." Samantha's eyes widened as the realization dawned on her. "You want me to pretend to be your girlfriend?" Nathaniel's jaw clenched. "It's temporary, just long enough to get the deal done. Once everything is finalized, we'll go back to normal." Samantha stared at him in disbelief. "Are you out of your mind? You think I'm just going to play along with this ridiculous charade for the sake of your business?" Nathaniel's eyes darkened, and for a moment, she thought he might explode in anger. But instead, his voice softened, almost pleading. "I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important." Samantha opened her mouth to argue, but the look in Nathaniel's eyes stopped her. He wasn't just asking for the sake of the deal, there was something more. She could see the weight he carried, the pressure he was under, and despite her better judgment, a part of her wanted to help him. But not without a cost. "What's in it for me?" she asked, crossing her arms over her chest. Nathaniel's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "A significant bonus, for starters. And once the deal is done, I'll make sure you get the promotion you've been working for." Samantha raised an eyebrow. "So, not only do you want me to be your fake girlfriend, but now you're bribing me too?" Nathaniel's expression hardened. "Call it what you want, but you're good at playing the role when you need to, Samantha, and I know you can handle this." Samantha sighed, running a hand through her hair in frustration. She didn't want to get involved in Nathaniel's personal drama, especially not when her own feelings for him were so confusing. But the offer was tempting, and she couldn't deny that playing along with his scheme could open doors for her. "I'll do it," she finally said, though her tone was less than enthusiastic. "But I have conditions." Nathaniel arched an eyebrow. "I'm listening." Samantha met his gaze, her expression serious. "I'm not going to lie to anyone outside of this deal, and I want complete honesty from you. No more pushing me away, no more secrets." Nathaniel hesitated, but eventually nodded. "Agreed." Samantha felt a surge of uncertainty wash over her. What had she just gotten herself into? The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation as Samantha and Nathaniel prepared to sell their fake relationship to the public. Samantha found herself thrust into a world of high society events, fancy dinners, and photo ops with Nathaniel by her side. It was strange, pretending to be something she wasn't, especially when her real feelings for Nathaniel were far more complicated than either of them cared to admit. At first, it was awkward. Nathaniel was stiff and formal, treating her more like an employee than a partner. But as the days went by, something began to change. There were moments when his guard slipped, moments when he would look at her with something other than indifference. One evening, as they attended a charity event together, Samantha caught sight of Nathaniel watching her from across the room. His gaze was intense, and for the first time, it wasn't filled with the cold arrogance she had come to expect. "You're staring," she teased when he finally approached her. Nathaniel smirked, though there was a hint of warmth in his eyes. "I was just admiring how well you play the part." Samantha rolled her eyes. "I could say the same about you. You almost seem human tonight." Nathaniel's expression softened, and for a brief moment, Samantha saw the man he tried so hard to hide. The man beneath the arrogance, the man who was still healing from old wounds. But just as quickly, the moment passed, and he was back to being the Nathaniel she knew. Still, there was something different now, a shift in the air between them, a softening in their dynamic. And though she hated to admit it, Samantha found herself drawn to him in ways she hadn't expected. But she also knew that this charade wouldn't last forever. Despite the shift in their dynamic, Samantha kept reminding herself that this was all just a temporary arrangement. It wasn't real. But the longer she played the role of Nathaniel's girlfriend, the more complicated her feelings became. There were moments when he would catch her off guard, like the time he showed up at her apartment unannounced with takeout after a particularly stressful day at work. He had stayed longer than expected, and for once, their conversation wasn't about the company or the deal. They had talked about trivial things, movies, childhood memories, even embarrassing moments, and it had felt normal. Then there were the little things. The way his hand lingered on her lower back when they walked into a room together. The way he would check on her during events to make sure she was okay. And the way his eyes softened when he thought no one was looking. It wasn't supposed to feel this real. One evening, after yet another social function, Samantha found herself standing on the balcony of Nathaniel's penthouse, staring out at the city lights below. The cool breeze brushed against her skin, but she barely noticed it. Her mind was too focused on the swirling thoughts inside her head. Nathaniel joined her a few moments later, a glass of whiskey in hand. He stood beside her in silence, his presence comforting yet overwhelming at the same time. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked after a long pause. Samantha sighed, leaning against the railing. "I was just thinking about how strange this all is. A few months ago, I couldn't stand you. And now," she trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence. "And now?" Nathaniel prompted, his voice low and curious. She glanced at him, her heart skipping a beat at the way he was looking at her, like she was the only person in the world that mattered. It made her feel vulnerable, exposed. "And now, I don't know what to think," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what's real and what's just part of this arrangement." Nathaniel's gaze darkened, and he took a step closer to her, his hand brushing against hers on the railing. "What if it doesn't have to be just an arrangement?" Samantha's breath caught in her throat. "What are you saying?" Nathaniel hesitated, his expression torn. For a moment, she thought he might backtrack, but then he spoke, his voice raw with emotion. "I'm saying that maybe this is real, or at least it could be, if you wanted it to be." Samantha's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. This was what she had wanted, wasn't it? For Nathaniel to finally let his guard down, to admit that there was something between them. But now that it was happening, she wasn't sure how to respond. "I don't know," she whispered, turning to face him fully. "You've been so closed off, Nathaniel. I've seen glimpses of the real you, but then you push me away." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, his eyes filled with a mix of frustration and regret. "I know I haven't made this easy, but I'm trying, Samantha. You have no idea how hard it is for me to let someone in." Samantha bit her lip, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that this could be something more than just a business arrangement. But there was still a part of her that was afraid of getting hurt, afraid that Nathaniel would go back to being the cold, distant man she had first met. "I need time," she finally said, her voice trembling with uncertainty. Nathaniel nodded, though there was a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. "I can give you that, but don't wait too long, Samantha. I'm not the most patient man." He turned to walk away, leaving her standing there with her thoughts swirling in the night air. And as she watched him disappear back into the penthouse, Samantha couldn't help but wonder if she was making the biggest mistake of her life, or if she was on the verge of something incredible. In the days that followed, Samantha tried to distance herself from Nathaniel as much as possible, hoping that some space would help her sort through her confusing feelings. But it didn't work. If anything, the more she tried to keep her distance, the more she found herself thinking about him. Every time she saw him at the office, every time they attended another social event together, every time their hands brushed or their eyes met, her resolve weakened just a little bit more. And Nathaniel didn't make it any easier. He wasn't pushing her, not exactly, but he wasn't giving her any room to forget about him either. He was always there, lingering just at the edge of her thoughts, reminding her of what he had said on the balcony that night. Maybe this is real, or at least it could be. The problem was, Samantha was starting to think that maybe he was right. One evening, after another long day at the office, Samantha found herself lingering outside Nathaniel's office door. She had no real reason to be there, no work-related excuse, nothing to justify knocking on the door, but her feet had carried her there anyway, as if drawn by some invisible force. Before she could change her mind, she knocked. "Come in," came Nathaniel's voice from the other side. Samantha opened the door and stepped inside, feeling a rush of nerves as she saw Nathaniel seated behind his desk. He looked up from his paperwork, his expression unreadable for a moment before softening slightly when he saw her. "Samantha," he said, his voice low and welcoming, "what brings you here?" Samantha hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say, but then she remembered the promise she had made to herself, to be honest, both with him and with herself. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice quiet. I can't stop thinking about what you said." Nathaniel's eyes darkened, and he stood up, walking around his desk to stand in front of her. He was so close now, and she could feel the heat of his body, the intensity of his gaze. It made her heart race. "And what have you decided?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Samantha swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. "I don't know if I'm ready for this. For us." Nathaniel reached out, gently taking her hand in his. His touch was warm, grounding, and it made her feel safe in a way she hadn't expected. "I understand," he said softly, "but I'm not going anywhere, Samantha. Whenever you're ready, I'll be here." Samantha's heart swelled at his words. It wasn't the grand declaration she had expected, but it was enough, more than enough. And as she looked up into Nathaniel's eyes, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she was ready to take that leap after all. The next few weeks passed in a blur, with Samantha and Nathaniel continuing their arrangement. But something had shifted between them. The fake relationship they had been pretending to have was beginning to feel more and more real with each passing day. And then, one night, it all came to a head. They had been attending a charity gala, one of the many events they had to attend together as part of their arrangement. Samantha had been feeling off all evening, her thoughts swirling with confusion and doubt about her growing feelings for Nathaniel. As they stepped outside onto the balcony for some fresh air, Nathaniel reached for her hand, pulling her close to his side. "You seem distracted tonight," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. Samantha shivered, though it wasn't from the cold. "I'm just thinking." Nathaniel's eyes darkened as he looked down at her, his expression serious. "About us?" Samantha nodded, unable to speak. She was too overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment, by the way Nathaniel's presence seemed to consume her entire world. And then, before she could stop herself, she blurted out the truth. "I think I'm falling for you." Nathaniel's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. Samantha's heart raced, panic rising in her chest as she wondered if she had just made a terrible mistake. But then, slowly, a smile spread across Nathaniel's face. A real smile, not the cold, calculated smirk she was used to seeing. "Good," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "because I've already fallen for you." Before Samantha could respond, Nathaniel closed the distance between them, capturing her lips in a deep, passionate kiss. The kiss was everything Samantha hadn't expected but had secretly hoped for. It wasn't rushed, nor was it forceful. It was soft, deliberate, and full of unspoken emotions. Emotions that neither of them had dared to voice until now. Nathaniel's lips moved gently against hers, drawing out a depth of feeling that Samantha hadn't realized she had. For the first time in a long while, the walls that Nathaniel had kept so firmly in place around his heart seemed to crumble, and as he held her close, his arms wrapped securely around her waist, Samantha felt something shift between them, a new beginning. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Nathaniel rested his forehead against hers, his fingers lightly brushing her cheek. "I've wanted to do that for so long," he whispered, his voice husky with emotion. Samantha smiled softly, her heart fluttering. "Then why didn't you?" Nathaniel sighed, his expression clouded for a moment. "Because I didn't think I deserved you," he admitted. "I'm not an easy man, Samantha. I have flaws, more than I'd care to admit, and I didn't want to drag you into my mess." Samantha gently cupped his face, her thumb brushing against his jaw. "No one's perfect, Nathaniel, and I never expected you to be. But I don't care about the flaws. I care about you." Her words seemed to reach him in a way that nothing else had before. Nathaniel's eyes softened, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked vulnerable, unguarded. "You really mean that?" he asked quietly, as if he couldn't quite believe it. Samantha nodded. "I do, but you have to let me in, Nathaniel. I can't keep guessing what's going on inside your head." Nathaniel closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. When he opened them again, there was a determination in his gaze that made Samantha's breath catch. "I'll try," he promised, his voice steady. "I'm not used to letting people in, but I'll try. For you." It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was enough. Samantha knew that Nathaniel's struggle to open up wasn't something that would be solved overnight, but this was a start, and for now, that was all she needed. In the days that followed, things between Samantha and Nathaniel slowly began to change. Their relationship, once built on the foundation of a business arrangement, had evolved into something much more personal and much more real. At work, they still maintained a level of professionalism, but there were moments when their eyes would meet across the conference table, or when Nathaniel's hand would brush against hers in passing, that made it clear that things had shifted. And outside of work, they spent more time together. Dinners, walks, quiet evenings at Nathaniel's penthouse. It was as if they were discovering each other all over again, but this time without the pretenses and barriers. But despite the growing connection between them, there were still challenges. Nathaniel's old habits, his tendency to close himself off, to retreat into his work when things got difficult, hadn't completely disappeared. And there were times when Samantha found herself wondering if he would ever fully let her in. One evening, after a particularly stressful day at the office, Samantha found herself standing in Nathaniel's kitchen, watching him as he poured himself a glass of whiskey. He seemed distant, his usual warmth replaced by the cold, calculated demeanor she had first encountered. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, stepping closer to him. Nathaniel didn't look at her as he took a sip of his drink, his eyes fixed on some distant point. "Just work," he muttered. "It's nothing." Samantha frowned, not convinced. She knew Nathaniel well enough by now to recognize when something was bothering him, and this was one of those times. "Talk to me," she urged gently, placing a hand on his arm. "I'm here, Nathaniel. You don't have to do this alone." For a moment, Nathaniel didn't respond, but then, slowly, he set his glass down on the counter and turned to face her, his expression weary. "I'm not used to this," he admitted, his voice low. "Letting someone in. depending on someone else. It's difficult." Samantha nodded, understanding. "I know, but you don't have to be perfect, Nathaniel. You don't have to have everything figured out. I just want you to be honest with me." Nathaniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" Samantha pressed, her voice soft but firm. Nathaniel hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether or not to tell her the truth. But then, he spoke, his voice raw with vulnerability. "Because I'm afraid," he confessed. "Afraid of losing you. Afraid that if I let you see all of me, you'll realize I'm not worth it." Samantha's heart ached at his words. She had never seen Nathaniel like this, so vulnerable, so unsure of himself, and in that moment, she realized just how deeply his fears ran. "You're worth it," she said firmly, stepping closer to him and taking his hand in hers. "Nathaniel, you're worth it. I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe that." Nathaniel's eyes softened, and he squeezed her hand, as if drawing strength from her words. "You make me want to be better," he murmured. "For you." Samantha smiled, her heart swelling with affection. "And that's all I need." The weeks that followed were a turning point in Samantha and Nathaniel's relationship. Though they still faced challenges, Nathaniel's occasional bouts of self-doubt, the pressures of work, they had begun to find a rhythm together. It wasn't always easy, but they were learning to navigate their new reality, one step at a time. One evening, after a long day at the office, Samantha found herself curled up on Nathaniel's couch, flipping through a book while he worked on his laptop. It was a quiet, peaceful moment, the kind of domestic simplicity that she had never imagined sharing with Nathaniel when they first met. As she glanced up from her book, she caught Nathaniel staring at her, a soft smile playing on his lips. "What?" she asked, smiling back. Nathaniel shook his head, his expression warm. "Nothing. I'm just happy." Samantha's heart fluttered at his words. It was such a simple statement, but coming from Nathaniel, it meant everything. "Me too," she whispered, setting her book aside and moving closer to him on the couch. "I'm happy too." Nathaniel reached out, pulling her into his arms, and as she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, Samantha knew that she had made the right choice. Despite the ups and downs, despite the challenges they had faced, she had found something real with Nathaniel, something worth fighting for. And as they sat there, wrapped up in each other's warmth, Samantha couldn't help but smile to herself, because for the first time in a long while, everything felt right. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more delightful stories.